Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 4.14, JFK's Foreign Actions. It includes information that goes along with the Section 3 on your Unit 4 study guide. Now you have control over this lecture, so pause whenever you need to, write down information that helps you with your study guide. Your study guide will help you figure out what's important. Rewatch it anytime you need, and write down any questions you have and bring those to class. Let's go ahead and get started. You learned a bit about Kennedy's idea of flexible response and his attempts to create good relationships with other countries through goodwill in the last sets of notes. But peaceful reactions were not always possible, and we're going to look at a few of the more threatening actions JFK faced as president in this set of notes. Two of the actions we'll look at today will actually deal with the same area, Cuba. The first of those is the Bay of Pigs. In 1959, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba. He then cut diplomatic ties with the U.S. and began negotiations with the Soviet Union. So he was a communist leader. Cuba became communist and was becoming allies with the Soviet Union. The U.S. was really concerned about these actions, and this now put a communist government just a mere 90 miles away from our coastline. It's also a failure of containment. Kennedy and the CIA developed this plan to overthrow Castro and reinstate the U.S.-friendly government that had been there. The CIA trained Cuban nationals to lead and participate in this military action. The Cuban nationals we're talking about were individuals who had fled Cuba as it became communist, people who the new government was bad for, doctors, professors, journalists. Those are individuals who would suffer under a communist dictatorship. So we're not talking about trained military. In April of 1961, Americans and Cuban nationals invaded Cuba, and the attack was a total disaster. This was partly due to the lack of training and preparation, and partly due to poor military choices made by the U.S. For example, the invaders were supposed to have air support, American planes bombing as they invaded from ships. At the last minute, the air support was canceled, so the invaders were left without that support. As the first major international involvement under JFK, it was really an embarrassment to the U.S. The world questioned the U.S.'s international intentions and JFK's ability to lead. The incident created negative feelings between the U.S. and Cuba that really have existed up until very recently. And, in some areas they still do, but they've eased more recently. So shortly after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, in June of 1961, Kennedy then met with the Soviet leader Khrushchev. So he's reeling from looking bad in the Bay of Pigs, going to meet with the Soviet leader. Kennedy left the meeting feeling like Khrushchev was disrespectful, wouldn't listen or compromise, and was actually attempting to bully him in regards to Berlin and the American role in the city, kind of trying to kick him out. So Kennedy felt like Khrushchev was very disrespectful and didn't listen. So in reaction, Kennedy asked Congress for $2 billion with a B, dollars to increase the size of the military, which is an increase in the arms race. A lot of that increase was going to be focused in Germany and Berlin and adding more military there. In response to the military buildup of the American areas, and to stop further defections from the east, because people were leaving East Germany or East Berlin and going into West Berlin especially, the Soviet Union responded by closing East Berlin to the free world by building the Berlin Wall in 1961. So while Kennedy's policies there in Berlin were not a complete failure like the Bay of Pigs, that's not a win for Kennedy. We now have the Berlin Wall, a physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, and nothing passing between the two sides in Berlin. However, in October of 1962, Kennedy finally got his foreign policy win with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the second Cuban event. That year, American spy planes learned that Cuba was preparing to build nuclear missile launch sites with the help of the Soviet Union. So the U.S. actually feared that the close proximity of this threat was actually close enough to potentially send nuclear missiles into some of our major cities, including Washington, D.C. In response, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to keep Soviet ships away from Cuba, so they weren't able to deliver materials or missiles to Cuba, which kept the missiles out and the U.S. safe. Kennedy and Khrushchev secretly negotiated the removal of the missiles that existed in Cuba, and the nuclear threat ended. In return for the removal of the missiles from Cuba, the U.S. promised to destroy some of our arms stockpile, making the Soviets feel less threatened in the arms race. That's about the closest we've ever come to nuclear war, but in this case, Kennedy proved himself a capable leader and showed his unwillingness to go to war, so we'll call that a win. He was successful. That's the end of U.S. Notes 4.14. Hopefully you learned something. If you have questions, bring those to class tomorrow.